Hello, and welcome to the first lesson of the course Attack. Today we'll be covering attacking the uncastled king. Our first example comes from the very famous game Steinitz von Barbodine from the 19th century, and it's a great example of how to attack along the e-file. So, an attack on the e-file has two requisites. First, the opposing king must be located here on the e-file. As you can see, it's on e8. And the king also cannot escape. He can't castle kingside or queenside because of white's pressure on e7. So what is black's plan here? Black wants to naturally escape this pressure by castling by hand. Castling by hand would be something like playing king f7 followed by rook e8 and then king g8, where the king is now safely tucked away on the king side and he didn't let up his defense of the e7 knight. Of course, white doesn't want to allow that. So how does white add on additional pressure? Well, he looks at his pieces and tries to bring them into the game. This knight on f3 really isn't doing a whole lot, and it would be much better placed, say, on e6, where it can place quite a lot of pressure on the g7 pawn. So Steinitz plays a very brilliant pawn sacrifice, d5, that clears up squares for his knight. Clearly, black cannot capture the pawn with his queen, otherwise white would capture on e7 with checkmate, and the knight clearly cannot capture the pawn because of the pin. So black captures the d5 pawn, and then Steinitz brings his knight to d4. You can see, jumping to e6, the threat of knight c7, the threat of knight takes g7, etc. Looks very, very good, and it's definitely well worth the pawn. So black continues with his plan of castling by hand, with king f7. King f7, rook e8, or rook hc8, king f8, etc. White continues with his plan, bringing his knight to a more useful square, and then black brings his h-rook into the game. So you can see attacking the uncastled king isn't only just pressure on one file. You usually will have to attack from some other vertical as well. So white discovers another weakness in black's position, namely this g7 pawn, and brings his queen to g4. So you can see he has quite a bit of threats now. Knight g5 check with the discovered attack against the queen, queen takes g7 check followed by queen f8 mate. White has piled up quite a bit of pressure, and black defends his pawn with g6. Now Steinitz has seen this upcoming combination, right when he probably played d5, and this is one of the most famous combinations in chess history. So it starts off with the discovered check knight g5. Clearly, he cannot capture the knight because white would win the queen, so he brings his king back to e8 to defend the queen. And here's the culmination of the attack along the e-file. Rook takes e7 check is the brilliant move. So how exactly does this move work? Well, clearly, if you play queen takes e7 check, then if you play queen takes e7, rook takes c8, and white is winning. So queen takes c7, rook takes c8. It's clearly winning for white. And what happens if he plays king takes e7? Well, what follows is pretty. White can follow up with rook e1 check. If king goes to d8, then knight e6 check, followed by knight c5 is a winning discovery. And if he plays a move like king to d6, then white can wrap up the game nicely with queen b4 check, king c7, knight e6 check cuts off the escape square to d8, and after king b8, queen f4 check, white wraps up the game shortly after rook c7 captures, and then rook e8 check. So it's clear that this rook on e7 is a poisonous rook. Black cannot capture it either way. Clearly, king d8 is not an option because then queen takes d7 is simply checkmate. So black can play king f8. At first, this looks a little weird because black's queen is hanging, but you can see white's back rank is also very weak. White cannot capture this queen anyway because a rook takes c1 is checkmate after the rook on e7 blocks on e1. So this queen is also poisoned. But white has a trick up his sleeve. He can continue this checking spree, as this black queen can never capture the rook because of rook takes c8 check. So the black king must continue to avoid these checks, and he can't go back to e8 because queen takes d7 is checkmate. So after king g8, we have rook g7 check. The queens can still cannot capture, and neither can the king, because then the white would take on d7 with check. So after king moves to h8, rook captures, king back to g8, and then rook g7 check. The king cannot come back here to f8 because a very simple knight h7 check would wrap things up after captures and queen takes d7 with check. Or, if you're so inclined, king e8, and then queen takes d7 is a quick checkmate. So the king cannot go back to f8, so he must play king h8. And now white can wrap up this combination very cleanly with the forced checkmate. I'll just play through the line. It's just pure calculation here. After queen h4, king takes g7, queen h7, king f8, queen h8, king e7, queen g7, king e8, and after queen g8, the black king is ultimately forced to go back to d8, where the game ends after knight f7 and queen d6. So an extremely long mating combination. Feel free to replay this sequence if I went a little too fast, but I hope you can appreciate the elegance of this combination that started with a simple d5 to open up lines for the knight, and then rook takes e7, and finally the beautiful checks along the 7th rank. In our next example, we're going to look at attacking the uncastled king through a very weak square, which is f7 for black and f2 for white. The reason why for the uncastled king these pawns are very weak is because these pawns are the only pawns that are only protected by their respective kings. The king on e1 is the only defender of the f2 pawn, and the king on e8 is the only defender of the f7 pawn. So I'm going to play through an opening that's very popular amongst beginner to intermediate players called the fried liver, which shows how vulnerable this square can be. So after these opening moves, white decides to move his knight twice and move it to g5. We can see that right from the get-go, white has pressure on the f7 pawn through his knight on g5 and his bishop on c4. And there's only one real good response to this, is blocking off the a2 g8 diagonal. There are a variety of other responses, but for the sake of focusing on the f7 pawn, I'm just going to go through the line that's bad for black. So after d5 captures, there are quite a few lines, knight a5, knight d4, but it's generally regarded that knight takes d5 is a mistake because this uncastled king can come under a lot of pressure. So white has two responses here, d4 and knight takes f7, but let's quickly take a look at knight takes f7. So after this piece sacrifice, black's king loses the right to castle, and it's stuck on e6 for quite a bit. White can continue the pressure with knight c3, play d4, castle, open up lines, but white is generally regarded to have a very good attack and more than enough compensation for the sacrificed piece. So this is an example of how the f7 square can be very vulnerable for the uncastled king, and you'll find some very interesting examples in the exercises.